Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What is the scariest thing that you have witnessed with your own eyes? Part 2. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My cousin getting attacked by a Rottweiler. We had a neighbor, 14, that had a Rottweiler tied up in their backyard. We always thought it was friendly. We would hang out with our neighbor often. This one particular time, my neighbor's sister was feeding or playing with the dog. My cousin, 8, and his twin brother went over to join her. One of them got on the doghouse and the dog didn't seem to like that, so it latched onto my cousin's thigh. He jumped down and tried to run away, but the dog pushed him down and grabbed onto my cousin's head and started thrashing him around. I was in shock. I couldn't move, and it took me a few seconds to realize what was going on. It was like watching it happen in slow motion, his head being snatched back and forth and blood everywhere. I snapped out of it when I saw my neighbor run toward them and started punching the dog in the face. He let go, and my cousin took off running and screaming that he had a hole in his head. I ran over to him and tried to calm him down. His scalp was hanging off his head. I could see the white of his skull. We lived next to my parents' restaurant, and the parking lot was full of customers. I called 911, and the ambulance was there in minutes. He was taken to the hospital and had to have his scalp stapled and stitches on his chest and thigh. He was scared of dogs for the longest after that, do you think? Arrived at an accident about 30 seconds after it occurred. A friend of mine was driving and rolled the car. She was thrown clear, no seatbelt, wear them FFS, and hit a tree. I found her, did first aid, and helped the paramedic lift her onto the stretcher and into the ambulance. Her body stopped functioning about a week later, but it's pretty obvious she died there. Massive brain trauma. It just took a while for the end. When I was maybe 7, my cousin and I were playing outside. We went in the front yard and saw my brother in his car with his friend. Their eyes were closed, heads back against the headrests, windows rolled up on a hot summer day. They then started making these odd jerking movements with their arms and heads. Being kids, my cousin and I thought they were just being silly and messing with us. But when we noticed the drool and that they weren't responding, we got scared and got my parents. We didn't know at the time, but we were watching my brother and his friend overdose. I don't know what they took, I probably never will. My parents sent us in the house while they took care of the boys. They thankfully survived, but that image of them passed out in the blue 90s Toyota will stick with me forever. This is not an easy thing. You're a good son for what you did.
Not safe for work. Graphic. My stepdad committed suicide right next to his plow truck while my mom watched. I wasn't there at the time, but immediately after it happened, my mom called me in an absolute state. By the time I arrived, the police had already taken the body, but the windshield and front corner panel were completely covered in his brain and blood. My mom rode to the hospital, having a panic attack, and I stayed to clean up. I drove his pickup into town, brought it to the car wash I had been to dozens of times over the years, and hosed her down. After delivering my now dead stepdad's truck back to my mom's house and pushing the blood trail in the snow up into a mound, I rode to the hospital in my car to see how my mom was. She was pretty loopy. They gave her something, and I remember feeling comforted by that, hoping she would maybe forget part of the trauma she had witnessed. I stayed a while, but eventually decided to head out, figuring I'd stop at my mom's one last time on the way to make sure I didn't miss anything. Really didn't want her to have to come home to any more than she had to. My inspection of the immediate area looked good, with the exception of some weird-looking thing on the same side of the house. The side of the house he had shot himself in front of had a fenced-in area for mom's pups, and the mystery object was directly above a large, homemade doghouse. I walked through the house, entered the side yard, climbed up onto the doghouse, and pulled the mystery white blob off the siding. Had the iris been facing away from the wall, I would have known immediately it was his eyeball, but I didn't. I grabbed it and spun it in my hand before his blue iris looked into mine. My heart sank. I don't know quite how to explain the feeling, but it made me physically ill. My guess is that the concussion blast from the bullet blew one of his eyes out at a high speed. I pitched his frozen eyeball off into the field, got back in my car, and drove home to get drunk. Working the graveyard shift at a convenience store, in the back office stoned, playing medieval Total War II. Door chime rings, and I look over at the CCTV monitor. Guy with a ski mask and gun had just walked in. I jumped up and slammed and locked the office door. The guy takes 2 steps toward the office, pauses, then jogs out the front door. Usually these things end up okay, but I've always had the feeling that if I had been out front, I wouldn't have survived. My mom called me at midnight asking me to go check on my dad because she was worried about him but didn't say exactly why. I found him drunk in the woods behind the house sitting on a stump with a pistol in his mouth. I spent the next 40 minutes sitting there talking him down. He eventually gave me the gun and went to bed. I'll never get over it. This entire scenario could have ended 100 different ways, and none of them good. While in college, I took my girlfriend climbing in a wildlife management area. Afterwards, at her request, we camped there. I had climbed there often, but never camped overnight. About midnight, the place came alive with rednecks on ATVs shooting guns at God knows what. I tell my girlfriend that we should leave, and she thinks that I'm overreacting. After about an hour or so, people were driving right past our tent, and we were camped back in the middle of nowhere. The place is over 10,000 acres, so I told her we were leaving. At about 2 a.m., I get out of the tent, and there are 2 grown men, both probably in their 40s, standing against a tree staring at me. They don't have a car or ATV anywhere nearby. They had walked up on us very quietly. I was immediately freaked out. The fat one looks right at me and says, "We were just wondering what your girlfriend's name is." At this point, I'm about to shit my pants, and I did something really dumb. Being from Alabama, I had a small pistol in my pocket, .22 revolver, and I pulled it out and aimed it at these 2 rednecks. They immediately start acting like normal effing people, apologizing their ass off and acting like I'm overreacting. I tell these 2 guys to start walking down the dirt road away from our campsite. That's when one of them reaches down, and I realize that there are 2 rifles leaned against the tree behind them. I tell them to leave the guns and that I will drop them off at the DNR station at the main gate. We argue for a few seconds, and I had to cock my pistol to convince them to leave. So these assholes finally start walking off, and I have their flashlights and guns. I can see them in the moonlight walking down the road, and I'm sure that one or both still have pistols on them. So I yell for my girlfriend to get in my truck, parked about 100 feet from the tent, and she is hysterical and refuses to leave the tent. So we then argue because I don't want to take my eyes off of these 2 rednecks who have walked about 400 feet down the road and are now just standing there staring back toward us. I finally run over to the tent, get her, and we jump in my truck. We leave everything at the campsite other than the guns and her sleeping bag, which she was wrapped around her. We get the F out of there, and my girlfriend cried hysterically the whole time. I lived over an hour away, but she demanded that I drive her to her parents' house about 2 hours away. She wasn't mad at me per se, but she didn't want to talk to me or touch me. Eventually, we got a cell phone signal, and she called her parents. They spoke the last hour of the drive. When I finally got her home, it was real awkward, and that was obviously the end of our relationship. The next day, I drove back to the DNR station to leave the guns, but I then realized that it was closed until hunting season. I didn't want to leave them unattended, so I left a note on the door and took them to the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office had significantly fewer questions than I expected. I told them what happened. They ran the serial numbers on the guns. Neither had been used in a crime, and they copied my license. I never heard from them again. I was diving in the Florida Keys on a very popular reef, was in about 30 feet of water, just kind of exploring. I came around this one corner of the reef, and about 10 feet from me was the biggest bull shark I've ever seen, and it was just coming toward me. This thing was at least 9 to 10 feet long. I've never pulled my dive knife out faster from my ankle. Thankfully, it just went on its way and swam right past me. I did run my hand along it as it swam by, which was awesome. Cycling home after work in London and seeing some discarded chips and tomato sauce in the gutter. As I rode slowly past, I saw a crow pick up a chip, dip it into the sauce, and then gobble the whole thing down. Repeatedly. I still think about that sometimes, and occasionally it haunts my dreams. 2 drunk homeless guys were fighting, and one got pushed onto the Miami Metro rail tracks with a train visible in the distance. He wasn't able to stand on his own, and nobody was helping. I jumped down and forced him back up as someone else pulled him onto the platform. I made it back up with only like 20 seconds before the train came. I was afraid I would be electrocuted or wouldn't have been able to get him back in time and would have had to leave him. I saw someone slip and fall from the top of Half Dome in Yosemite. I'm a first responder and have seen bad things, but I have control for the most part in those situations. Watching someone tumbling to their death and knowing nothing can be done was hard. Certainly didn't help my fear of heights either. Slick up there. I was a skydiving instructor for a couple years. There was a really cocky kid that went through our program who was pretty bad at listening, barely tested into the solo jump phase, etc. I didn't have the authority to kick him out, and regardless, I wasn't close enough to the situation to know whether or not they were wrong in letting him jump. His first jump, he had a poor free fall, not uncommon, but not terrible canopy work. I saw his second jump, where he didn't follow radio directions under canopy and turned without looking, such that his parachute wrapped around another student, obstructing the student's vision and mobility. At this point, with the first kid hanging by a collapsed canopy wrapped around the second kid, 1,000 feet off the ground, they're trained to ride it down since neither is moving at a dangerous speed towards the ground. But of course, Dingus doesn't want to follow direction, or the advice given to him over the radio. He cuts away his first parachute, going back into free fall to allow his reserve to deploy. Watching from the tower that day, I thought I would witness this kid bounce off the ground. Fortunately, we had some of the best riggers in the country working for us, and the reserve deployed immediately. No sooner had it fully deployed, that kid touched down. He couldn't have cut it any closer. Suffice it to say, this kid didn't get to jump again.
Thank you for everything you did in this story, and helping the people that you could.
I saw a head-on collision between two SUVs on a remote section of road near Jasper, approximately 100 kilometers from the closest hospital. I was first on the scene, pulled bodies from burning vehicles after breaking windows. My shirt caught on fire, pulling people out. I attempted CPR with 2 other people on 4 of the 6 people until they passed away in our arms. Their bodies were broken, or CPR was not possible due to severe facial injuries and pneumothorax. One man kept reaching up to me, asking me if he was going to die, and telling me he couldn't breathe, but his lungs were obviously perforated. I breathed for him until he passed away. I told him he was loved, and was with people who cared for him. The vehicles caught on fire, causing a forest all around us, and had to be put out with a helicopter hours later. During the hour that it took for EMS to get to the scene, a bear walked through the scene, and we had to constantly scare it away, probably due to the smell of blood. I watched 2 people burn to death because I could not reach them through the fire. I promise, I tried to save them. I was covered in blood, body fluids, bone chips, and a tooth stuck in my knee. There was a baby laying face down on the road, and it was placed on what I thought was the mom while doing CPR. In the end, the baby and mother were the only ones of all 8 who lived. So many people's lives were destroyed that day. I still have PTSD from the experience. I often feel like I failed at saving people, but their bodies were so severely damaged. Smells, sounds, textures were all so vivid that I get flashbacks. I'm emotional just writing this. Since then, I've had many horrifying dreams, but the dreams that stand out most are dreams of meeting the people who passed. In the dreams, they tell me positive words of encouragement and appreciation, even laughs and jokes about life. It's weird. Please drive safe. Love each other. I tried everything I could do to help. I promise to God I tried. Edit. I sincerely thank you all for the outpouring of kind, loving, and positive thoughts and comments. I am at peace with the events on that day and very happy in life. I'm sincerely not a hero. I was just trying to help where I thought I could. Whenever I think about that day, I just think about hugging the loved ones of the people who lost their loved ones. Spread that love around and we will be all heroes. If you were involved or know anyone at the scene, please reach out to me. I saw one of my best friends wreck his motorcycle right in front of me while we were out riding. A guy in a Jeep Liberty pulled out to make a left-hand turn right in front of us. I was riding tandem behind my pal, so I had plenty of time and space to see things unfold and avoid a collision. My buddy, who didn't wear any gear, crashed into the side of the car, slamming his head against the hood. This was several years ago. My buddy lived through the ordeal, and I had PTSD in a bad way. But it was terrifying watching someone I've known for almost 20 years crash like that.